This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for dynamic play in various popular opening systems. This move initiates the French defense, a solid opening where black aims to create a robust pawn chain and contest the center with a flexible pawn structure. This move establishes a classical pawn center, directly challenging black's space and setting the stage for the French defense, where white typically aims for a queenside pawn majority while black seeks counterplay on the kingside. This move initiates the French defense, a solid and strategic opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn and aims for a closed, positional game with counterplay on the queenside. This move, nc3, is a central pillar of many main lines in the game after 1, e4 e6 2, d4 d5, developing a piece to control the d5 and e4 squares while maintaining flexibility for white's pawn structure. This move, nf6, develops a knight to a central square, attacking white's e4 pawn and preparing to castle, firmly establishing black's presence in this variation of the French defense. This move develops the bishop to an active square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing to castle kingside, a common plan in the French defense to achieve quick development and king safety. This captures the pawn, opening the d-file for white's queen and bishop, and simplifying the central pawn structure for black. This recapture on e4 is typical of the French defense, establishing central pawn control and preparing to develop the kingside knight to its most active square. Developing the knight to d7 supports the advance of the c-pawn and prepares to castle kingside, while also maintaining flexibility for potential queenside operations. This move forces black to recapture with their knight, disrupting their pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. The recapture on f6 with the knight is standard development, reinforcing central control and preparing to castle while avoiding a doubled pawn structure. This knight maneuver develops another piece, prepares castling, and supports the central pawns while potentially aiming towards squares like e5 or c5. Developing the bishop to e7 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for castling kingside, a standard defensive maneuver in this variation of the French defense. This move develops the queen to a more active square, preparing to castle queenside and potentially support a kingside pawn storm or central expansion. Castling kingside is a natural and safe move, securing the king and activating a rook while preparing for potential pawn advances in the center. Developing the bishop to g5 pins the knight on f6, indirectly pressuring black's e7 bishop and preparing potential future kingside attacking ideas. This move is a common defensive maneuver in the exchange variation of the French defense, forcing white's bishop to either retreat or be exchanged, thus clarifying the pawn structure. This move, 10, bxf6, exchanges white's bishop for black's knight, altering black's pawn structure by creating doubled f-pawns and opening the g-file, which can lead to positional advantages for white in the middle game. This recapture opens the f-file for black's rook and allows the queen to potentially challenge white's queen, while also solidifying the pawn structure. The queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a pawn push or piece sortie. This move prepares to fianchetto the dark squared bishop, reinforcing control of the long diagonal and creating a more active defensive structure for the king. This pawn push initiates a kingside pawn storm, aiming to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces towards the black king. This move, e5, initiates a pawn break in the center to open lines for black's pieces and challenge white's central pawn presence, potentially leading to a more dynamic game. This capture opens the d-file and challenges black's central pawn majority, forcing a decision about pawn structure and piece activity. This move aims to challenge white's central pawn majority and activate black's bishop on the active diagonal, forcing a decision regarding the e5 pawn. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weakened kingside pawns and potentially setting up attacks along the light squares. This move simplifies the position and removes white's active bishop, but it also allows white to recapture with the c-pawn, potentially opening the c-file and creating an outpost on d4 for white's knight. Castling queenside initiates a direct kingside attack, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after black's moves and create play against the exposed black king. The move 15, bg7 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to defend the kingside and potentially support a queenside pawn advance later. This move opens up the d-file for the rook and prepares to exert pressure on black's queenside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after black's early e5 advance. This move aims to centralize the queen and connect the rooks, preparing for potential activity on the d-file or supporting the pawn push on the kingside. White centralizes the queen to prepare for an attack on black's kingside and potentially exert pressure on the c-file. This move initiates white's plan to exploit the open d-file, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially create a passed pawn. The move rhd1 centralizes the rook onto the semi-open d-file, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially exploit any weaknesses on the queenside. After the pawn exchange on d5, this move aims to simplify the position and potentially gain an advantage by eliminating white's active rook on d3, thereby contesting the open d-file. The rook recapture on d3 is crucial for centralizing your king's rook, defending the d-pawn, and preparing to contest the d-file, aiming to improve piece activity and pressure black's position. The rook now becomes active on the open e-file, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially support an e5 pawn push later. This move aims to secure the d4 pawn and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, creating a more solid pawn structure for white. This move solidifies black's pawn structure on the queenside, preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially expand on the queenside with moves like b5. This move prepares to activate the rook on the e-file, aiming to challenge black's control and potentially exploit weaknesses in their pawn structure. This pawn advance aims to challenge white's centralized queen and potentially open lines for black's pieces. The king's move to kc2 is a defensive maneuver that frees up the d-file and prepares to support the pawn push c4 in the future, aiming to restrict black's queenside space. This move begins to establish a queenside pawn chain, aiming to support the advance of the b-pawn and gain space, while also preparing to connect the rooks. This move begins a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure by attacking the c6 and b6 pawns. The queen moves to a more active central square, supporting the advance of the e-pawn and preparing to contest the d-file. This move reactivates the rook to a central file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially launch an attack on the queenside pawns. Black's queen repositions to c8, potentially eyeing the c5 pawn for support and preparing to contest the open c-file if white's rook moves there. White repositions the queen to the more active central square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a kingside advance or a central pawn break. Black repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially challenge white's control over the center. This move activates the rook, aiming to contest the d-file and potentially create pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. The move 26, kf8, is a prudent defensive maneuver, repositioning the king away from the open d-file and the potential attack from white's rook and queen, while also preparing to possibly connect the rooks. This move aims to solidify white's central pawn structure and restrict black's queenside play by preventing the pawn advance to b5. This move defensively repositions the king to a safer square, anticipating potential threats and preparing for the upcoming pawn structure complications. This move prepares to develop the queenside pawn structure and control the crucial c4 square, preventing black's potential pawn advances. The king retreats to f8 to avoid potential checks along the d-file and to connect the rooks more effectively for future defensive or offensive operations. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing it for active participation in the endgame and potentially supporting pawn advances on the queenside. The black king's repositioning to g8 is a defensive maneuver, seeking greater safety behind the pawn chain and potentially preparing for kingside castling if the opportunity arises. This move repositions the rook to the 6th rank, threatening to infiltrate black's queenside and exploit the weakness on c6. Black has successfully blocked the dangerous open c-file with the queen, but the material imbalance on the queenside remains concerning for white's doubled rooks. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, challenging black's control and preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside. The move k6 offers a centralized queen, potentially improving its activity and control over key squares like d5, while also preparing for future pawn pushes or exchanges. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to gain kingside space and potentially open lines for the rook and bishop, preparing for an attack. The king's repeated retreats are a symptom of white's growing pressure on the queenside and central files, indicating a need to centralize and prepare for potential kingside play. This move, qf4, repositions the queen to eye the kingside and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside, while also maintaining defense of the e5 pawn. The king continues its careful repositioning, seeking maximum safety and avoiding potential threats on the central files or the kingside. The repetition of moves suggests a strategic stalemate where neither side can force progress, and white's queen repetition is likely aimed at probing for weaknesses or preventing black from initiating any counterplay. The king repositions to a more active central square, potentially preparing to support pawn advances or defend against threats along the newly opened central files. The white king now moves to a more central and active square, preparing to join the fight and potentially support pawn advances or provide defense. This move repeats the previous position, indicating a lack of concrete plans for either side and a continuation of the drawn-out maneuvering phase where neither king feels entirely safe from potential checks or advances. The king's prolonged journey to the queenside has been a cautious one, and now finding a more secure central post prepares to support future pawn advances or a potential kingside defense. The repetition of this king move, while seemingly passive, is a prudent way to regroup and avoid potential tactical complications arising from white's increasing central presence and potential kingside action. This move repositions the king to a more secure central square, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially support a pawn advance or centralize the king. Further, the repetition of king moves suggests a desire to consolidate or possibly avoid unseen threats. But black needs to find a more active plan rather than passively shuffling the king back and forth. After a series of king moves, this maneuver to g3 aims to centralize the king, potentially preparing for a kingside pawn push or to better defend against potential checks or breakthroughs from black's queen or rook. The black king is repositioning to a potentially safer square, aiming to consolidate defensive resources and prepare for potential pawn pushes by white. With the opponent's king still in the center and white having established queenside space with the pawn advance, this move aims to open lines and create attacking chances for white's pieces, particularly the king and rook. Black finally breaks the pawn chain on the kingside, creating an open file for their rook and potentially weakening white's king further, but also sacrificing pawn structure. The capture on h5 opens the g-file for white's rook, creating immediate attacking potential against black's exposed king. Black's king is very exposed after the pawn grab, and moving the queen to e7 now looks to protect the g7 pawn indirectly and prepare to contest the g-file. But white's kingside pawn push with h5 is a serious threat. This move is a good attempt to regain initiative by attacking the weak f7 pawn, though black has ways to defend it and solidify their position. This move continues to shuttle the king between squares in a desperate attempt to avoid the perpetual check threat emanating from white's queen and rook. This move places the rook on the 7th rank, a highly active outpost that pressures black's king and potentially prepares to support a kingside pawn advance or infiltrate further into black's position. This move captures the pawn on e5 and simultaneously checks the white king, forcing a response and disrupting white's pawn structure while aiming to simplify the position or create tactical opportunities. The king steps forward to defend the pawn and activate itself, aiming to support potential breakthroughs or counterplay in the center and kingside. This move correctly retrieves the queen from the dangerous diagonal and prepares to challenge white's active queen and rooks. This knight sacrifice is a tactical decision to open lines for the rook and queen, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create threats along the 7th rank, especially after the pawn capture. This check is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create counterplay, as black is significantly down material and facing a strong attack. White's king is now safely tucked away from the immediate checks and centrally positioned to support the rook on d7.